G'day everyone and welcome to part 2 of From There to Here, a Trekzone Spotlight special presentation. I'm Matt Miller. Waiting for me in the LA studio once again is Pedraza. This time around we're going to be talking about the Axanar lawsuit, the timeline that's gotten us to this point. Joining me for part 2 of From There to Here is Pedraza once again in LA. Carlos, thanks for your time.
Thank you. It's good to be here again.
Now, December 2015 is the month and the year that things pretty much changed forever when CBS and Paramount jointly filed a lawsuit against Alec Peters and Axanar Productions. Was it a surprise to you?
Yes and no. I was spending the holidays in Astoria, Oregon, and I saw the same Hollywood Reporter article that I think everybody else did that announced the lawsuit had happened. And I had been at that point away from fan films for probably 7 years or so, so I wasn't actively involved in any way with them other than, social connections I had with people who were still involved in the community. And so I was sort of dimly aware of Axanar. I was dimly aware of Prelude to Axanar. I hadn't seen it all the way through yet, but I'd heard that it had debuted at Comic-Con, and I knew that they were raising money and that they were doing that pretty successfully. I didn't know much more than that. I mean, I have friends who on both sides of this case. I have friends who, were approached to work on Axanar, one who turned it down, others who did go on to become involved with it. So I knew from them at least some of a little bit of the inside story, at least at the early stages. And it seemed to me like, yes, it was ambitious, which was great. It seemed to me that the approach was a very shrewd one, about promising something big and then delivering little things to sort of impel people to continue to support financially the eventual big goal. Again, I don't have a problem with that, but it was pretty transparent that was what was happening, And so when Prelude came out, I was like, and when I finally saw it, what I thought was, well, it's great. I mean, it's fantastic. They've got some great actors in it. The effects look good. The direction was great. But it's being produced as a documentary, as a mock documentary. That gives you a lot of leeway in terms of how you tell a narrative, how you spin out a narrative that doesn't translate very well into regular narrative fiction or a feature-length narrative. And this isn't news. I mean, Rob Burnett, the director of Axanar, has said this himself. It was like making the Axanar feature would have been a totally different and bigger challenge than Prelude because the structure is completely and utterly different. And that's why, when some people say, I watched Prelude and thought this is great and it's a great example of what Axanar can do. That's only true as far as it goes. It's a great example of what Axanar can do in making a mock documentary. It doesn't necessarily tell you how well it will meet the challenges of storytelling in the much wilder west of feature production. And now that I've seen most of the scripts for Axanar over the course of several years, I'm not convinced that from a storytelling perspective it was going to be anything particularly groundbreaking, it's hard to tell from a script, but a script can tell you a lot of things. A script is a blueprint. It's not a finished thing, but blueprints have to have the right supports in the right parts of the house and for it to hold up well. And I didn't always see all of that. Jody Wheeler, who's a colleague of mine and a producer and screenwriter himself, reviewed the August 2015 version of the script, and he lays it out pretty well what its strengths and weaknesses are. And it had strengths, of course, but I'm not sure anyone who read it would proclaim it the best Star Trek script ever.
Do you think making a feature film was over-ambitious of the Axanar team? Should it have stuck to the episodes that were being churned out by New Voyages and continues on a semi-regular basis?
I don't really see that as having been a problem. You only have to look at Star Trek Horizon, made by Tommy Kraft. It's a feature-length fan film, made for just the barest fraction of the cost that Axanar was to have cost, and it's successful, on so many levels. Just even in viewership, it reached and matched Prelude to Axanar's viewership numbers on YouTube in about 5 or 6 months that had taken Prelude 2 years to achieve. So it resonated with fans. It did not send off alarm bells with CBS for that reason anyway. I think there were other reasons because of the Axanar lawsuit. But I don't think that thinking about it in terms of a feature was any kind of a red flag. The red flag had to do with the commercialization of the property, and the red flag was that they were aiming. Everyone talks a lot about the $1.4 million that was raised for Axanar as if that's what it was going to cost. It was going to cost a lot more than that, and potentially a lot more than that. If you look at the Indiegogo pitch that was made and really price out what the cost of Axanar the feature film was going to be, it was hitting $2 million. And that was assuming that they got all the money at once and produced the whole thing all at once. There's very clear evidence that that crowdfunding at this level was starting to hit diminishing returns. They were still bringing money in. They raised, I think, $565,000 in their Indiegogo project from, I think, August through early January, August 2015 through early January 2016. And which is, it's nothing to look down upon. But when you realize that they were planning on starting production probably around this time a year ago, had the lawsuit not happened, they did not have enough money in hand to make this feature film. By Alec Peters' own admission, they had $274,000 on hand at the end of 2015. And even, they had decided, because of the pace of the fundraising was not matching the pace of their pre-production, and the pace that they wanted for the actual principal photography for Axanar, they split it up into, I think, 4 episodes that were going to cost $330,000 each. Well, they didn't even have enough for the first one. They were planning on going ahead and hoping that between December and February they would raise that difference between 330 and the 274 that they had on hand. But that's assuming that the 274 would was dedicated completely to production. We know now that a significant part of that was going to go to the build out of the studio, completing that studio. And once the lawsuit hit, all of it went to the studio. Alec Peters' own words about this. By the calculations I've done, there is they could have spent anywhere from as much as around $750,000 on this studio, and it's still not done. It was supposed to help fund Axanar. It was supposed to help fund future projects, and it's not ready yet for commercial productions to go in and use it. So it's sitting there, partially complete, and not a revenue producer, and just being, a revenue sink. They prepaid their significant portion of the lease on the warehouse that they turned into the studio, and once that was over, it's $12,000 to $15,000 a month that's just going out the door with nothing coming, resulting really from it, and $15,000 is a lot of money. You can take, that's most of Tommy Kraft's budget for Star Trek Horizon. Other fan films have taken that much money and produced something. And I know that the ambitions for Axanar were high. And again, I don't have a problem with the ambitions. I have a problem with the priorities. Once the priority became, we need our own studio in order to make Axanar, that was the turning point. That was the pivot that went, that made them go off mission. Because it became now this target that was just required a lot of resources to really turn into what they needed it to be, and that changed everything. And that is what often happens with very successful crowdfunding campaigns. There's a whole body of research that's been done about where successful crowdfunding campaigns have gone wrong. And one of the first things you learn from that research is that too much success early on in fundraising through Kickstarter or Indiegogo has so often led to exactly the same kind of mission creep that, what was promised never gets delivered at the level that it was. And Axanar is the latest victim of that.
The $15,000 a month that they're outlaying in this studio that is yielding no return. It's funny that it's that figure, because that is the exact figure that I came up with to produce the entire Eternal Night franchise, which was going to be a 3-season arc involving live action shooting, green screen shooting, audio drama for some prequel and character development. This whole thing, this whole kit and caboodle that I had together was $15,000. And I never managed to come up with it. And something that I don't often say is that I did attempt a crowdfunding campaign. Interestingly, here in Australia, we can't. Kickstarter doesn't allow anyone outside of the US. So I used a platform here, and I raised $57.50 with a big thanks to my parents. So I looked at that.
That was your allowance, right?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah. Well, that was the $7.50. That was the allowance. The $50 was because I cleaned the floors.
Very generous. Very generous.
So it was this sort of thing that really disappointed me, that there was all this money being thrown at these productions in the States, and they were getting bigger and bigger, and the smaller ones were getting smaller and smaller, and then Tommy Kraft comes out. Well after I'd been thinking about all of this, he came out last year and said, by the way, guys, here's a feature-length production. I made it. It cost me $50,000, and I did it. And Axanar still sitting there spinning its heels with its 1.4, spending $15,000 on a commercial venture. So I guess what I'm sort of moving onto here is the guidelines that dropped around May. So we'd spent 6 months with this production, with this lawsuit, not really going anywhere. Alec digging his heels in, fighting that he was David in this David and Goliath battle. He had a chat with me in April and said that this is totally unjust and unfair, and I just want to make Star Trek my own way. CBS has then come out in May and said, well, here you go, you can make Star Trek your own way, but it's got to fit within this. But then, having said that, they didn't actually say it has to fit in with this. They said, if it fits in here, we're not going to bother you. If you go outside of that, we're not going to tell you what's happening. We're going to leave our options open. So we had these guidelines. They came down, and really, Axanar could still be made as a feature-length production in quotations, as 4 by 15-minute episodes.
I don't think that's true under the settlement terms. The settlement terms probably prohibit that. Like they dismissed the lawsuit or gave up on the lawsuit in exchange for Axanar agreeing to make no more than those 2 15-minute episodes. So while the guidelines largely govern a lot of how Axanar Light is going to be produced, there are some exceptions that are allowed for other fan productions that Axanar can't take advantage of. Crowdfunding is one of them. Public fundraising is one of them. length is one of them. So they specifically cannot go longer than those 30 minutes. There are other productions out there that are going longer than 30 minutes. They do that at their own risk, but as before, CBS is going to consider this on a case-by-case basis and evaluate whether the degree to which any given production is going outside of the guidelines makes it worth their while to seek legal action or, take any kinds of steps. So, that's up to them. They're the copyright holders. They have that right under the law to determine what they're going to do with any particular production. But they have said anything inside those guidelines is fair game and go to it. So that's the way the landscape looks today. In fact, outside the guidelines, the landscape today is exactly what the landscape was before the guidelines. It was, you're doing this at your own risk. The guidelines have just created a risk-free area, but for anyone thinking of doing something out of the guidelines, CBS hasn't promised to come raining down on you. They don't want to spend resources policing the guidelines. What they're going to look for are people who step over bright lines. Commercialization was an obvious one, and taking the steps that are necessary. And and even in the case of Axanar, they gave them warning. And the Axanar narrative is that that this came out of nowhere. That Alec Peters picked up the Hollywood Reporter on December 30th and saw he was being sued, and oh my gosh, what a surprise! That's just not the case. There was a meeting that he had with CBS officials in August 2015. Now, obviously, there's a he said, she said about what might have actually happened within the boundaries of that meeting. But what we do know is that in that same month, CBS put out a statement identifying Axanar and saying that that Axanar had been warned that there were concerns and that, I hope I remember the exact wording, but that they would evaluate their options in terms of taking action against any professional commercial venture. And those are the key words, professional commercial venture. And that's also what separated Axanar from other fan films. Because there was, they had a merchandise, they had store, they had, they were building the studio that they were going to be renting out to bring in more revenue. These were actual revenue streams. It wasn't like a one-off T-shirt or a DVD of an episode. It was those things and more. And so that's what put us where we are, put them where they ended up in terms of being sued. So the narrative that they're little David against big Goliath is it's a convenient one. It's one that will get a lot of headlines because it does seem that way. I'm no corporatist, but I'm an artist. I'm a producer. I'm a writer. I believe in intellectual property. I believe in being able to have that protected so that I can make my livelihood from it. So they're entitled to that. The fact that they're bigger than I am doesn't mean they don't get that same protection. You can argue, and many people do, that copyright has been bent, contorted into something where copyright holders, particularly corporations, can hang on to the ownership for way too long. And I think that's a fine argument to make. I think if you want to advocate for changes in copyright law, to do that, I'm behind you on it. But until those changes are made, there's still the law, and you need to follow it.
That's right. And something as simple as making a commercial venture out of someone else's intellectual property, I don't understand how that enters into someone's mind that this is something that I should do, something that I can do. I've been running Trekzone for coming on 14 years now, and there's always been that inkling of, maybe I should run some ads and I can earn some money off this and start paying some of the costs. But I've never wanted to do that, even to cover costs, because Star Trek is my passion. It's not my property. So for me to make any money off it just makes no sense to me and leads to all these sorts of complications and problems. And So I can't fathom the thought process that went through Alex's mind, that said that a studio was a good idea, that a donor store that is still operational now, selling things, is a good idea. I just don't understand where all this has come from. And then to even say that CBS and Paramount have no right to defend their property because they're not using it. They're not making Trek the way that these diehard fans want to see Trek.
And and I don't have a problem with that. Is there a hole to be filled by a production like Axanar? Sure, there are people who want Trek the way it used to be. Of course, what that really means varies from person to person. But what they share in common is they don't like the direction Star Trek has taken in the Paramount films since 2009. And they're still waiting. Jury's still out in terms of what they're going to think about Discovery. But they wanted something Axanar offered, and I don't have a problem with that if it's a fan film. It's when they cross the line into commercialization, and I'm sorry if I keep haranguing about that, but that is in fact what was the concern for CBS. It's why they were sued. It wasn't just the scope. Yes, the fact that they were bringing in $1.4 million and aiming for $2 million, and for setting up commercial ventures based on this far into the future, that made CBS realize, look, this isn't just a one-off fan film. They're setting up a business, and the working capital for it is coming from fans of our property and raised under the banner of Star Trek. And even though that banner was later removed, once they were much farther into their third crowdfunding campaign, Axanar had established its own brand at that point. They thought they could go ahead and get rid of the Star Trek and maybe make it less likely that they were sued. And as it turns out, it wasn't just the name; it was the fact that they were, making money off of it.
Exactly right. And then we move on a little bit further, and J.J. Abrams and Justin Lin come out at that Star Trek Beyond event in LA, saying that talking about the lawsuit and saying that it was going to go away before they'd even discussed it with the higher ups, led to all sorts of problems and all sorts of craziness continued on, and then Lin and Abrams were subpoenaed as well to testify as part of this suit.
Yeah, it's an interesting confluence of legality, litigation, and public relations that happened around that event and around what J.J. Abrams and Justin Lin took as a stand. And I think in theory their stand was a perfectly fine one. They want to support fans. They want to support fans who love Star Trek so much that they make their own within certain limits. And I don't know how much they knew about Axanar prior to making that statement or trying to intervene on their behalf. Maybe they knew a lot, maybe they only knew a little. The sources I have tell me that it was more on the little end of the spectrum. And that they weren't aware of like the extent of Axanar's commercial venture around its film. But in any case, so there was that part that they were intervening on behalf of fans, which I think is great. They got some direction from at least Paramount, maybe not CBS, but at least Paramount, saying you can say this, but go no farther. And so when they said it's going away, it's much more likely they were referring to the fact that CBS and Paramount wanted a settlement, had offered a settlement to Axanar. It's a settlement I learned about in late May that is substantially similar to what this settlement ended up being. And so this could have been resolved back then without this waste of time and resources. But there was a PR battle that was being engaged in here, and for Abrams and Lynn, their words were misconstrued. Abrams said it's going away within a few weeks. Well, that can mean anything. That can mean, we are intent on settling this case within a few weeks. Here are the terms of the settlement. And they were terms that were not accepted by Axanar. And in the meantime, the mainstream media took what Abrams said, that it's going away, and turned that into CBS and Paramount are dropping the lawsuit, when that was never, ever the case. So you had people months later, checking in on what was going on with Axanar and saying, I thought this was going away. J.J. Abrams said it was so. And of course it didn't, because I don't think he was saying it was going to be dismissed. He would have said those words if that's what he meant. Yeah. It was more reflective of what I think CBS and Paramount said in their statement that very same night, which was, we're working hard on a settlement to this case, which they were. They wanted to pursue a settlement. Of course, 95% of lawsuits end in settlement, and everyone loses a little bit, and so they were, that settlement offer was basically, yes, you can make it, but you have to do it under these guidelines. And the guidelines hadn't, been announced yet, and so, but the guidelines that came out in June were pretty much the guidelines that were offered to Axanar in at least May. It might have been earlier in April. I know they started meeting, having settlement negotiations face-to-face in April.
So the case stretched on, and we came eventually into January, where we're getting closer and closer to trial day. And then all of a sudden, a few weeks ago, it was announced that settlement had been reached. What do you think prompted, knowing that there was at least one settlement negotiation previously, what do you think prompted Alec and his lawyers and Axanar to settle this time around?
Well, I'm not privy to what those discussions, as they were coming to the end of the lawsuit, were like on both sides. I do know how the case was stacking up against Axanar. They lost their defense theory was basically gutted by the judge when he said, this is not fair use. You cannot claim fair use as a defense for what you've done. So your case has to be evaluated by a jury without fair use being a part of your defense. That was like stabbing at the heart of the defense theory. They depended on, especially Prelude, being found to be transformative in order to be able to move forward with Axanar. And it was clear that wasn't going to be the case. They had to win on other terms. So the path to victory for Axanar significantly narrowed after the judge made that ruling at the beginning of January. And and then other things were going on. More evidence was coming out, depositions. We were learning more and more about Axanar's financials that were raising lots of red flags. For the most part, the actual financials remained under seal, and we didn't see them. But we do know from Alec Peters' own deposition the kinds of concerns around what was happening with Axanar's money that eventually was going to become public. And I know that Alec Peters denies that the potential release of the financials were the reason why it settled out of the blue. And I don't think that was the only reason. I mean, I know, this settlement didn't happen between the judge's decision on that on Tuesday and the announcement being about the settlement being made on Friday. It had been in the works for a while. I mean, they'd had a federal magistrate judge, Charles Ike, assigned to mediate between them, and I think the battle lines were drawn at that point, and until the the judge found that there was no fair use. That upset the sort of the balance of power that they had reached unsuccessfully in terms of a settlement when Magistrate Judge Ike was involved. Then we moved to some of these evidentiary rulings that Judge Klausner was starting to make that narrowed the path to victory even more. And I think we know they had a pretrial conference on January 9th in preparation for the trial that was to have begun on January 31st. And one of the things that happens at those pretrial meetings, because it's really the last formal pretrial meeting before a trial begins, is a judge tries to push them to settlement. Within the bounds of what he can and cannot do, a judge will lay out what is there in terms of the two cases and say, you need to think about whether this is strong enough for you to move forward. And again, I wasn't there, so I can't tell you what he said or didn't say, but I do know that that's one of the purposes of that pretrial meeting on January 9th. So probably things started happening around then, and as more of the judge's rulings came in that were probably going to expose more evidence about Axanar and how it worked behind the scenes than maybe they wanted, all those factors built up to why a settlement happened. It wasn't just one thing. It wasn't just the judge saying, we're going to unseal your financial records, and oh my God, in 2 days they decided they were going to settle. It was the straw that broke the camel's back, but there was a whole camel's back that already existed before that particular ruling by the judge.
Well, Carlos, it's been absolutely fantastic in part two to chat to you about the case and wrap it up as concisely as we have. I think that it's been an absolutely tumultuous 2016. We're going to take a break now, and we're going to come back for part three, looking at the future of Star Trek fan films and Axanar as well.
Look forward to it.